Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are taking a seriously deep dive into some absolutely fascinating, vivid arguments from Chapter 17 of The Death of Utopia. We're going to be looking at what exactly happens when the rigid, unbending theories of a Maoist insurgency crash headfirst into the cold, hard reality of modern data, and, well, the philosophy of Karl Popper. It is a super compelling look at how societies actually transform. So let's get into it.
Okay, let's jump right in. Here is our intellectual roadmap for today. We'll start off with 2 ways to change, then we'll move into the Popperian open society, check out the digital battlefield, analyze demographics and falsification, and finally wrap things up with the insurgency's final irony.
All right, part 1, 2 ways to change, fire versus correction. Right out of the gate, the author sets up this incredibly stark dichotomy about how nations actually evolve.
So, the text lays out 2 totally distinct paths for societal change. Version 1, that's the communist path. Basically, burn everything to the ground, purge, and just promise a utopia once the dust settles. Version 2, on the other hand, is the democratic path. That means you criticize, you vote, you protest, and, crucially, you fix your mistakes out in the open. The author really frames this as a fundamental choice. Do we choose the path of fire or the path of slow correction?
I think this idea is captured perfectly by the philosopher Karl Popper. He said, "The real question is not who should rule, but how we remove bad rulers without violence." Notice how Popper doesn't sound like some fiery revolutionary shouting from the barricades. He actually sounds more like a pragmatic repairman. The source argues that once a society figures out how to peacefully swap out its leaders, the entire justification for an armed uprising just kind of vanishes.
Moving on to part 2, the Popperian open society, permanent self-correction. Let's see how the author applies this specific lens to the actual architecture of an open democracy. Now, what's really interesting here is the intense contrast the author builds between democratic humility and ideological certainty. Think about it. Popper's vision of democracy accepts that leaders are fallible, it openly encourages criticism, and relies on an open marketplace of ideas to spark reform. Contrast that with the Maoist movement. The text points out that they rely on an infallible party where criticizing the dogma is literally treated as absolute betrayal, and the ultimate goal is to replace society through violence. It's night and day.
So you might be wondering, what actually is the greatest insurgency killer? Well, the author argues it's not bullets, it's a return to civilian life and redemption. They call this the third door. See, instead of the martyrdom or the violent purges the movement expects, government reintegration programs like ECLIP and SBDP actually give former rebels a peaceful way back into society. It's essentially a system choosing to correct its mistakes rather than punish them.
Which brings us to part 3, the digital battlefield, the shift in terrain. Let's look at how tech completely flipped the script on the arena of conflict. The author poses a massive question here. Where exactly is the new battlefield? Because, as the text illustrates, the Maoist ideological framework completely failed to predict how the ground was going to fundamentally shift right beneath their feet.
We shifted rapidly from the old arenas, classrooms, printing presses, underground newspapers, straight into the new arenas of Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and Telegram. And the author brings up a vital Popperian rule for this digital age. You don't fight propaganda with silence. No, you defeat it by absolutely drowning it in truth and real-time fact-checking. The argument here is that a closed ideology loses the literal second its recruits start scrolling and verifying information for themselves.
All right, part 4, demographics and falsification, the inverse proportion. This is really the climax of the chapter, where brutal demographic arithmetic becomes absolute destiny. To really get this, we've got to talk about one key concept, falsification. Simply put, it means a theory has been tested under its exact predicted conditions, and the results prove it false. The author points out that the insurgency had all the socioeconomic conditions it claimed were necessary for a triumphant uprising, but instead of succeeding, it just withered. And this brilliantly illustrates why it withered. It comes down to hard demographics. We saw mass migration to cities, an absolute explosion in higher education, total digital media saturation, and massive electoral participation. The largest youth generation in Philippine history basically rejected armed struggle in mass. Why? Because they were too busy participating in a rapidly modernizing society to follow a rigid Maoist script. So, what you end up with is this wild inverse proportion, a shrinking armed movement trapped inside a booming democratic society. The source impartially views this massive demographic and geographic shift as a merciless death sentence for the insurgency. A bigger population, more education, and greater mobility simply collapsed the old revolutionary myth. And that leads us to our final section, Part 5, the Insurgency's Final Irony. A society moved on. Let's dig into the author's concluding thoughts on the ultimate fate of this movement. While the revolution was up in the mountains waiting for this supposed inevitable victory, undeniable realities just took over. The population surged, the cities thickened, the youth multiplied, ballots accumulated, and peace zones expanded. The math proved that history was definitely moving forward, but in a completely different direction than the movement predicted.
Which brings us to the chapter's ultimate irony. The country simply moved on. The movement wasn't really defeated in open war. It was quietly disconfirmed by society itself. They rejected a second life in a democratic space, choosing instead to wait for an absolute outcome that just never arrived. It is a pretty stark reminder of the profound danger of letting rigid ideology blind you to reality.
The author delivers this incredibly striking verdict on closed ideologies. They write, "A shrinking armed movement inside a booming democratic society is not a revolutionary force. It is a historical residue." Honestly, that is exactly what happens when a rigidly held theory completely refuses to admit its own errors.
So, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. Will a future built on closed doctrines ever outpace a society willing to admit its mistakes? That right there is Karl Popper's core insight. A society that can self-correct, even when it's super messy, will always have the evolutionary advantage over a utopia built on absolute certainty. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this deep dive leaves you eager to explore the profound power of self-correction in our own world.